Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. So, what we always talk about with communication, we like to kind of flip it because everyone that when we have a communication seminar, a class, a program, they feel like, okay, I need to become a better speaker in some way. And we remind them, first and foremost, to become a better communicator. Perhaps the easiest way to do it is to become a better listener. And so many people struggle with this. And so many people don't even include this as far as their top five to become a better communicator. They just figure it's something that I need to say differently or use different words or a different tone, different vocabulary. But you really identify in the book, there's three P's that impede people from listening well. Perhaps you can go through those and then we're going to unpack some of these great strategies.
Absolutely. So listening is critical. If you want to improve communication, you absolutely have to work on listening. It helps you target your messages. It helps you make sure that what you're saying is relevant and salient to your audience. And it makes sure that your response is appropriate. There are lots of barriers to effective listening. The three P's are first physical, noise. Something's just making lots of noise that's distracting. Imagine being at a concert or a sporting event, or for me as I get older, just a restaurant. There's a lot of noise that's in the situation. It makes it hard to listen. But there's also psychological noise, what we are doing in the moment. So as somebody's speaking, we're prejudging, or we're beginning to rehearse, or we're evaluating what we could say. So psychologically, we engage with things that aren't what's being said, and that gets in the way of listening. And then the final P is physiological. What's going on in your body? Maybe you're nervous, maybe you're excited, maybe you're hungry or tired. All of this impedes being present in the moment and listening deeply.
Now, you mentioned that the Stanford lecturer and consultant Colin Dobbs gives a useful three-step framework called pace, space, and grace. Perhaps you could unpack that a little bit for our listeners.
Yes, Collins is a wonderful person, and I love that you remember pace, space, and grace. So, Collins teaches a class at the business school where I teach, and he teaches something about crucial conversations, and he leverages this idea that applies directly to listening. And he and I talked about it, and with his permission, I use it as a way to teach listening skills. Pace, space, grace. The first thing we have to do in communication to listen better is to slow things down. Life comes at us fast and furiously. There's a lot going on. We've got lots of things competing for our attention. We have to slow down to listen well. In addition to slowing down the pace, we have to give ourselves space, not just physical space, move to a place where you can actually listen and hear, but more importantly, give yourself mental space. Allocate focus and present orientedness to who you are listening to. It's critical to give that attention so you can see the nuance and pay attention to it. And then grace. And grace is really in two ways. One, give yourself permission, grace, to look not just at what is said, but how it is said, where it is said. That might influence your understanding. And also give yourself permission and grace to listen to your intuition that comes up as a result of what you're hearing. So, through pace, space, grace, we can become better listeners, especially if we tackle and address the three P's that impede listening. And I encourage everybody to work on their listening skills. It will make you a better communicator. It will make you better in relationships. And ultimately, it'll allow you to foster better long-term connections.
I'm in agreement, and your mindset also matters when you're listening as well. Because if you're like me, which when I listen to some spontaneous situations or communication, whether it's personally, professionally, from my wife, I feel like I need to try to solve a problem. So I need to give them advice. So I'm listening, but I'm kind of pseudo listening. I'm staying silent, but I'm getting ready to interject a solution. And what you say, which is so apropos here, is a person with a listening attitude believes, rather than you having the solution, that the person speaking has the solution. You just have to bring it out of that person.
Absolutely. My wife and I struggle with this same issue. And my wife, if she were hearing me talk about listening, would come in here and say, I don't know, you still need some practice. But yes, so part of the desire to help people is to help them solve problems. And when we do that prematurely or we do that without full information, it can actually be frustrating. So when we remind ourselves that often the solution to the issues that people bring to us, the challenges that they face, is in their control, and they have full capacity to come up with that solution. Our role is really to be supportive, to ask questions, to reinforce information, to maybe play the foil and challenge some of their presumptions. But ideally, they have the information within them. And something very simple to do is when somebody brings you a problem, you can simply say, "Would you like me to help you solve it?" Or simply listen to you as you think through it. And then you have clear direction on what your role is. If we always assume somebody sharing a problem wants a solution, we might get into trouble.
That's a critical distinction to make. Even to ask that, make that explicit upfront so that you're better prepared to interact with them in the right way, in the manner that they feel supported, right?
Absolutely.
Now, the most counterintuitive part of what I read in the book was you need to structure your spontaneity. Because you give a great example about jazz, right? The best jazz musicians, they improvise, right? But they're not playing whatever notes come to their mind at random. They're improvising within the bounds of preset musical structures.
Yeah, the new book and the methodology it teaches has lots of counterintuitive ideas. The first is that you can actually get better at it. Most people think you're either born with the gift of gab or not. But the reality is, we can all get better at it. I've seen it in my own life, my students, the people I coach and teach, absolutely. But the other big one is what you just highlighted, is that you can prepare to be spontaneous. And if we think about it, it actually does make sense. If you've ever played a sport, you do a lot of preparation to be spontaneous in the moment of the game. You do drills and you run plays so that when you're in the moment, you know how to respond. And just like you said, jazz musicians play chord progressions, they practice a lot of ways that things go together so that when they're improvising in the moment, they're going down known pathways. Really important. And we can do the same in our communication. Structure is critical. What most of us do when we're put on the spot is we take our audience on a journey of our discovery of what we're trying to say as we're saying it. In other words, we end up listing information and rambling. Our brains are not wired for lists and rambling. Our brains are actually wired for structured information, for story. In fact, long term memory is sometimes called episodic memory, episodes, stories. So, structure really helps. Structure is nothing more than a beginning, a middle, and an end, a logical connection. The example I always give people, if you've ever seen an advertisement, you've seen a structure. They mostly fall into the structure of problem, solution, benefit. There's some need, issue, or challenge. Our product or service addresses that need or challenge. And ultimately, here's how you benefit from it. So, having a structure gives you a place to start and a place to end. It also helps your audience package things up so it's digestible much easier. So, structure is really key. And you can practice structure. So, when you're put in a situation where you need to leverage it, you can.
Well, and it's all about finding the right ways to use it. I'm a big proponent and advocate. The best leaders are the best storytellers. You can learn this skill just like you can learn what you just stated, how to be a better spontaneous speaker, be better with small talk, but it does take a deliberate strategy and approach. And like you mentioned, some of the benefits, stories are much more repeatable. They're going to last a lot longer. You're going to remember them easier. The processing fluency is easier with them. There's so many advantages to them. It's still, I'm a little bit amazed when I hear leaders say, I'm just not a good storyteller. I don't have good stories to tell. Everyone has good stories to tell, and it's a skill that you can build.
100% agree. And I think not just for leaders, but all of us need to be able to think through stories that are important to us and stories that exemplify our beliefs and our values and our vision. And you absolutely can work on them.
So you give some great structures on how to plan spontaneous conversations, but you say there's one, the Swiss Army knife of structures. Perhaps you can give us insight into what that is and kind of walk through an example using it.
Yes, it's three simple questions: what, so what, now what? These three questions can help you manage so many spontaneous speaking situations. Let me explain how it works. The what is your idea, your product, your service, your update, your feedback. The so what is, why is it important and relevant to the audience you're speaking to? And then finally, the now what is what comes next. Maybe it's, I'd like to take your questions, or let's set up another meeting, or here are the next three steps I need you to take. So, this structure, simply answering those questions, can really help you. Let me give you a couple examples. Imagine you're going to an update meeting and your boss or colleagues say, "So, what's the status of your project?" The what is your status? You walk them through what you've been doing. The so what is why it's important. And then finally, the now what is what are your next steps or what help do you need to get yourself to the next step? Very logical. Imagine we're having a feedback discussion where you ask me, you say, "Hey, Matt, how'd that meeting go?" The what is my feedback. I might say it went great, except when you talked about the implementation plan. You spoke a bit quickly and you didn't give a lot of detail. When you speak quickly, that's the what. When you speak quickly without a lot of detail, people might think you're not as prepared. That's the so what. Next time, I'd love for you to give more detail, like these two examples, and slow down a bit. That's the now what. So, by leveraging this structure in lots of different circumstances, you help yourself because you know where you're starting, you know where you're ending. It connects the ideas together, which makes it easier for your audience. And I'll let you in on a little secret. Every one of my answers has been in this structure. When you ask me a question, I give the answer, I explain why it's important, and then I typically give a way people can practice it or use it. So it's something that comes naturally after you rehearse and use it a lot.
And that's why it's the Swiss Army knife of structures.
That's exactly right. You can pull it out and use it for many situations.
So, how do you identify or get these stories? How do you stockpile these stories in advance? Any tips or strategies around that?
Yeah, so I believe that again, you can prepare to be spontaneous. So let's take a couple different situations. Imagine I'm going to a job interview. Well, I know what the job is, I know what my skills are. I could come up with some themes that I want to make sure I get across in the job interview. Maybe that I am very agile and can adjust and adapt as things develop. Or maybe it's I'm very technically competent in this one domain. Whatever your themes are, come up with some specific examples and stories that support the theme. Let's say now I'm going to a cocktail party, a small talk situation. Well, I don't know the conversations I'm going to have, but I might think about some things that are important. So let's say that this is a reception after a corporate event. Well, I know that the corporate event is going to have this speaker or this kind of idea it's supporting. I might come up with stories that are relevant and support those ideas that come from there. So I'm going in with some ideas at the ready. I may or may not use them, but I am ready to use them if I need them. So thinking about what's your goal and what the themes are, and then itemizing a few stories or examples that you have helps you feel more prepared. So you actually have some arrows in your quiver if and when you need to use them.
And I'll add that it doesn't take many to stockpile. You don't need a collection of 50 or 60, 5 to 10 to 15 are usually enough.
That's right. And if you can come up with a story or two that you can leverage in multiple situations, that's gold. I have a story that I can use for almost any situation I find myself in. I'll just give you the teaser, the start of the story, and you can see how I could use it. So it's a true story. The biggest fight my wife and I have ever had is over toothpaste. That usually gets a laugh, and then I say my wife's a roller and I'm a squeezer. And from there, I can take that story and I can make it about pretty much anything. I usually use it to talk about conflict and conflict resolution, but I could use it to talk about collaboration. I could use it to talk about reframing difficult situations. So if you have a story or two that you can start and feel comfortable with that you can pivot into different circumstances, that's gold because you always have something you can fall back on if you need it.
I like that advice. Well, now let's talk about the F word of spontaneous speaking, and it may be different than what everyone thinks.
Yes, it's not that naughty one. So, F word means focus. Many of us say much more than we need to when we communicate, either because we're discovering what we want to say as we're saying it, or because we want to demonstrate we really know our stuff, or in some cases, we want to show that we're worthy to be in the room we're in, and we say more than we need to. My mother has this saying, I know she did not create it, but it goes something like this: Tell me the time, don't build me the clock. A lot of us are clock builders when we communicate. Just tell the time, bottom line up front. The best way, beyond leveraging structure helps you be concise, is to remind yourself what is most important for the audience I am speaking to, center your communication around that, and remind yourself of the goal of your communication. When we communicate, I believe we should have a goal. And a goal to me has three parts: information, emotion, and action. In other words, what do you want the audience to know? How do you want them to feel? And what do you want them to do? And if you remind yourself of what's most important to the audience, what do I want them to know, feel, and do, all of a sudden, everything you say is condensed and you have a prioritized list, and that helps you be more clear and concise. So even in spontaneous situations, we can get better at it. A great practice for this. In my book, I give lots of these try this, where I want people to immediately apply a concept. Look at your last couple text messages. Text messages tend to be very spontaneous, and sometimes they say more than they need to. Read the last several text messages and ask yourself, what was my goal? What was most important to the person I was writing to? And then think to yourself, how could I have changed the message to be more concise? And in training your brain to think that way, you will end up communicating in a much more clear and concise way.
And another dimension regarding focus too that you mentioned, which I really agree with, and I love, what do you want people to know, feel, and do? I think a lot of people get the know right. They don't get the feel, and especially not the do right. So that's really where the issue lies. But even before that, why should they care? Where's the relevance? What's in it for them? Make it about them. And I think a lot of people don't, even though it's common sense, that's really not common practice.
Yeah. So my very first psychology teacher ever had this wonderful saying. The funny thing about common sense is it's not so common. And we need to remind ourselves that, we have to think about what's important for the audience. Why do they care? And you have to start from that point. The fundamental mistake people make when they communicate is they start from the wrong place. We start from saying, here is what I want to say, rather than what does my audience need to hear. My podcast that I do, Think Fast, Talk Smart, is all about communication. The number one bit of advice across the 100 of plus episodes that we've done is exactly that. Know your audience. What is important to them? It's said in many different ways, but that is the most critical, followed, not surprisingly, based on what we've discussed, by listening. You have to listen.
Great advice. The other piece that I got was really from one of your podcasts with Dan Pink, and it's talking about the curse of knowledge versus the curse of passion. And I see this, and I am guilty of this as well, is that I'm passionate about something. I expect everyone else to be equally passionate and be at the same level of knowledge I am, so I can speak more abstractly than concretely, like Jonah Berger and some of those say in their great books.
Yeah, and Jonah and Dan are they're great people. It was fun to get to know them. And you're right. We suffer from the curse of knowledge, the curse of passion. And what that means is we end up communicating at the wrong level. We don't make our content accessible. We use a lot of acronyms and jargon and complex terminology, and that gets in the way. The only antidote to the curse of knowledge and the curse of passion is empathy. We have to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. So, what that means is we have to define our terms. We have to avoid using technical language. A colleague of mine, Huggy Rao, and his co author, Bob Sutton, they have this saying that I love. They call it jargon monoxide. It sucks the air right out of the room. And we want to avoid jargon monoxide. We want to make sure we define our terms. If the goal of communication is to make common, jargon, acronyms, and technical information works against that. Now, that doesn't mean we dumb things down. It just means we have to find ways to make it accessible. Maybe we use an analogy. Maybe we tell a story. Maybe we use some kind of visual to help people understand it. But if we can be empathetic and understand the other person's starting place, we will communicate more effectively.
When I like what you say when you talk about technology to your family, you employ the grandmother test.
We do. So, my not surprisingly, my two teenage sons are very interested in technology and very adept at it, and my 85-year-old mother is not. And so they can have conversations that are frustrating on both ends. So I remind my kids of the grandmother rule, which is how could we explain this technology, often it's technology, so that grandma can understand it. And it really helps my boys take a step back and help them to understand that people don't always know what they know. And so in my own life, I apply similar rules to what I do. It might not be my mother, but when I go in and teach, I have to remind myself that my MBA students who are taking my class on the first day aren't where they're going to be on the last day. So I have to use different terminology and ideas up front that I might not use on the back end. So we have to be able to do this code switching such that we can make sure our content resonates at the right level at the right time.
Be the translator, and that's a great test that I'm going to start employing myself as well. And the other common issue I see with a lot of people is they're never concise enough, and brevity is always an issue. And another piece of the book that I really loved is your wife, and the mantra that you learned from her is using minimal words.
Yes, minimal word. So my wife unfortunately is married to a communication professor. So what do you think I do a lot of? I communicate and I lecture. And with our two teenage boys, she is always saying minimal words. What's the main point? What do you want them to take away? I tend to be a clock builder with my kids. I give them more information than they need. Minimal words. So it's been very helpful to parenting and perhaps other types of relationships.
Another great insight that you have in the book too is that when you're thinking about a spontaneous speaking situation, think about how to convey your message in a tweet, which is or an X, I mean, whichever platform you want to call it now. So you stick to that original 140 character limit.
Right. So it is much harder to say something concisely than it is to say it in a more verbose fashion. So if you challenge yourself, it can really help. In fact, there are improvisation games that force you to do this. So in an improvisation game, people will literally hold up their fingers and say something in a certain number of words. And then the next person has to say something similar, the same idea, not in the same way, with fewer words. And this is training your brain essentially to prioritize. So when I only have a tweet length, I have to think about what's the most important thing to say for this audience. I don't have all the words to use. So it becomes really, really important.
Absolutely. So those are the overall strategies. And since I have the communication expert here, especially the spontaneous communication expert here, before we end the episode, love to get in one of the applications, which really is the second part of the book. And the one that I struggle with, I hear a lot of people struggle with, is small talk. It might seem trivial, but it can deliver big results. And you have a great formula and an approach for it.
Yes. So the first thing that we need to think about is that small talk has a bad rap. We absolutely need to rebrand small talk. A lot of good things happen during small talk. In fact, I challenge you, Charles, and anybody listening in to think about some of their friends. How did you meet these friends? Probably initially through small talk. Good things happen. The problem is we approach it the wrong way. So I was very fortunate to interview Rachel Greenwald on my podcast. She is a fascinating person. She's a professional matchmaker and an academic. Think about that for a second. And she has this great way of talking about small talk. The goal is to be interested, not interesting. Many of us go in thinking of small talk like a tennis match, where I want to serve something amazing over the net and ace it and score. But that's not how effective small talk works. Small talk is more like that game called hacky sack, where you've got that beanbag, and the goal is to just keep the ball off the ground. And the best way to do that is I need to serve it to you in a way that you can easily get it so you can get it back to me. The best way to do that is to be curious and ask questions. And here's where that what, so what, now what structure can come back to help you. Rather than using it as a way to answer those questions to package information up, just ask those questions. So, Charles, if you and I were in a small talk situation, I can simply say, "Hey, Charles, what brings you here?" And you might tell me why you're here. And I'd say, "Oh, why is that really important to you?" And then you tell me, I say, "Oh, so what are you going to do next?" And so all of a sudden, I just asked you what, so what, now what? And that structure helps me further the conversation along, demonstrates curiosity, and gets us talking about something that is at least interesting to you and hopefully interesting to me. So, small talk can be easily navigated if we see it for what it is. It's an opportunity to connect, to extend, to expand. And when we do that and approach it that way, goodness can follow.
Great advice. Let's just talk about two pieces of this small talk conversation. First is how to initiate it, because a lot of small talk begins as how are you and what do you do, which is kind of generic and not that exciting. How would you recommend us change that script when we initiate small talk with someone?
Yeah, so we want to avoid what I call doom loops. Hi, how are you? Fine, how are you? Okay, now we're nowhere better off and it's much more awkward. So I recommend having a question or commenting on something in the environment, something in the shared experience. So if we're at a corporate event and there was a keynote, maybe I ask you a question about the keynote. If we're in a room, it's a cocktail party, I might pick something out that's happening in the environment and comment on it. I might say, and this really happened to me. I was walking into a room where I didn't know anybody. There was somebody walking next to me, and I looked around, And most people were dressed in something blue. It wasn't like a uniform, but lots of people had different blues on. I turned to this person. I said, "Did I miss the memo on wearing something blue?" He looked around and said, "Yeah, that's really interesting." And then all of a sudden, we struck up a really fascinating conversation. So, through observation, through curiosity and questioning, you can start. You just want to avoid closed questions that have a yes no answer, that are very trite and heuristic based, like "Hi, how are you?" or "What do you do?" That information can come out later, but get the person talking. It makes everybody more comfortable.
Well, how about during the conversation when you're kind of losing interest? And I love the phrase you use, avoid swiping left too soon.
So this is a problem with me, and this has been a perennial problem in my life. I have severe FOMO, and so I'm always wondering: is that conversation better over there? Should I be talking to those people? And what I do is I mentally I'm swiping left or right too soon. And you really just need to be present. Now, when you do want to leave a conversation, I would encourage you to use a technique, again, that Rachel Greenwald taught me. And the technique is she calls the white flag approach. And it's not because you're surrendering. It's in auto racing, they wave a white flag to signal the last lap. So everybody knows this is the last lap. So in a conversation, I might simply say, in a few minutes, I'm going to go talk to those people over there. But before I leave, I'd love for you to tell me a little bit more about this. So I'm signaling we're going to end this conversation very shortly. But before I go, I want one more lap around the track and I explain the topic or interest that I have. I love this technique. I use it all the time. It makes it easier for me to exit, and it makes it easier on the other person because they know in a few minutes that you're going to part ways with them. So I encourage you to think about using this technique of signaling leaving before you do, because otherwise, what do we mostly rely on to get out of these conversations? It's biology. I'm hungry, or I'm going to go to the bathroom, or I'm going to go get a drink. Right. And then invariably, what happens is the other person says, "Oh, yeah, I need to go to the bathroom too." And now you're stuck with them for even longer. So the white flag technique, I think, is a beautiful technique to help.
Those are some great strategies that I know are going to benefit so many listeners, including myself, in becoming better with small talk. So before we end this episode, love to ask you the questions that you ask at the end of every one of your episodes because I think they're great questions to end this episode on. And the first one, and I won't limit you to a certain number of words, but what is the best communication advice you've ever received?
Well, I've already said it. Tell the time, don't build the clock. And the reason I like this is the best example is, again, not only does it reinforce concision, but it has implied in it that you need to tell the right time to the person you're talking to. So you really need to think about who they are and what's important to them. So that is probably the most influential communication advice I've ever received because it's not only reinforcing concision, but it's also focusing on the audience centric nature of communication.
Thank you for that. Next one, a communicator that you admire and why.
There are so many. So I'm going to pick someone that many of your listeners might not have heard of. Her name is Brittany Packnett. Brittany is a young woman who she started a nonprofit, but she really focuses on confidence building. Now, I focus on confidence building too, but in a very specific domain when it comes to communication. She's talking about confidence in a much broader sense. And I am just so amazed and I marvel at her passion, her energy, the clearness and clarity in her messaging, the way she uses story and detail. I encourage everybody to check out her TED Talk and other talks she has online. Brittany Packnett is somebody that I'm really excited to learn from and to watch.
And the final question is, what are the first three ingredients that you would put together in a successful communication recipe?
Well, this isn't going to surprise anybody. Listen, be audience centric, and structure. If you listen, you will connect more. If you focus on the needs of the audience, essentially what you hear from them, and then you put your information in a structure, you will have success in any communication, be it planned or spontaneous.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining me today on this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Remind our listeners how they can learn more about your work and connect with you.
Charles, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Single best place to go to check out my material is mattabrahams.com. I have lots of resources that are free and pointers to other things. And I'm also a big user of LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn, please consider following. And the podcast Think Fast, Talk Smart is available wherever you get podcasts like this good one here. And listen in. We'd love to have you.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.